visitor is Reverend Choro Antonaccio, once again, gracing us with a Dharma talk, coming to us from Austin, I assume, this morning. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you again. We are in the middle of our fall practice period, our Ango. It's a total of 8 weeks, and it's gone really fast, and it's closing in on Sesshin, the Rohatsu Sesshin, the kind of intense, longest, coldest, darkest retreat of the year. And we end with this wonderful celebration of Buddha's enlightenment. So we emerge from the darkness into the light of Buddha's awakening, which is not separate from ours. And I wanted to offer you a talk that I actually gave here that opened our practice period last year. And it's the final teaching of Dogen, the founder of the Soto Zen that we all practice in our different lineages. You know, Dogen is the medieval Japanese monk, lived in the 13th century, and he brought the Chinese form of Soto Zen from China to Japan and established the school that we are practicing in. And I think probably most of you know, he died what to us seems young, in his early 50s. I think he was 53. And so from the age of 27 to 52 or 53, he established the school and brought together a group of monks who were able to carry on his teachings down to us. So his final teaching is actually kind of straightforward and easy to understand. I don't know how many of you have delved in deeply into Dogen, but he's sometimes mystifying or baffling or surprising. He uses language in, unfamiliar, unsuspected ways, which is part of his method, I think, to destabilize our sense of what we know and, our certainty about the way we are and the way things are. So this is kind of straightforward. It's called The 8 Qualities of a Great Person. And actually, it's kind of recapitulates the Buddha's last teaching, the founder of Buddhism, his final teaching. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the title of Dogen's essay in Japanese is Hachi Dainin Gaku. Hachi Dainin Gaku. So Hachi means 8 in Japanese. Dai is great. Nin actually means a being, not necessarily a person, a being. And Gaku is virtue or quality. So we often translate this as 8 qualities of a great person because it seems directed to us, to human beings. But it's a little more neutral than that, just a great being. Sometimes I think dogs have these qualities. They're great beings. Anyway, dainin also in Japanese has the quality of being an adult. And I don't mean that just in years. It's a mature person, a person of understanding. A person who's a grown-up, who's taken their place as a mature person, a mature being. And in the first line of his essay, he begins by saying, all the various Buddhas are extraordinary people, right? Great beings. They're grown-ups. That's what a Buddha is on some level, is a grown-up. So here are the 8 qualities. Besides the fact that we're all extraordinary people, there are these 8 virtues, he says, or qualities of which these exceptional people, these great people, become aware. So they're things that we actually already have, but we're not aware that we have these capabilities or these qualities. He says, becoming aware of these dharmas, becomes the cause for nirvana, or waking up. So in this case, dharma means, like an individual thing. A dharma can mean the teaching, but it can also mean an individual thing or phenomenon. So here are the 8. The first one is having few desires. The second one is knowing you have enough. The third is appreciating serenity. Then there's the fourth, making diligent effort. Fifth, not forgetting the teaching. The sixth is practicing samadhi, or concentration or meditation. The seventh is practicing wisdom. And the 8th is not engaging in useless argument or useless talk, which is easy when you're sitting zazen. At other times, it's hard. So I think it's kind of easy to, at a glance, to see why these qualities would be conducive to to nirvana. The opposite of suffering, the flip side of suffering, nirvana. And they are easy to grasp. And it's a list, right? Lists are a great tradition in Buddhism. We have 16 bodhisattva precepts. We have 6 paramitas, or perfections, on and on, right? And this is partly, a characteristic of an oral culture in which not very many people knew how to read and write. So it helps to remember things like, what are the 10 commandments again? People have to know they're 10, right? And you can come up with them. So you maybe want to memorize the 8 qualities of a great person, right? So, this is kind of one way of teaching, is to create a list. And I'll talk about some other related lists to this one. So I want to look at this list from 2 aspects. First, to hear about or see what these 8 virtues or qualities have in common with other teachings, other lists, so we can see how they fit into the whole of Buddhist teaching. But also I want to emphasize what Dogen says about these factors, right? And just bearing in mind that this is his final teaching, and it's also the Buddha's final teaching. So let's start with having few desires, right? There are 2 benefits to this. One suffers less, right? The first one is one suffers less, right? We suffer less. We're not driven by craving. And that in itself, in early Buddhist thought in particular, this generates merit. A person with few desires does not try to manipulate things or people to try to get what you want. Dogen says, and he's quoting the Buddha, one whose heart acts with few desires is always at peace and has few anxieties or misgivings. So, as I describe these, maybe you could think, how do I relate to this? How does this apply to me? Does it have the ring of truth? Do I feel some resistance, even if it does have the ring of truth? He continues, such a person feels no need for more. He or she always has more than enough. Having enough is having more than enough. In a word, one with few desires is virtually in nirvana, like already. This is what is called having few desires. And the second one really follows from this first one, right? Knowing you have enough, really feeling that. Obviously, clearly related to the first one, but the way Dogen expresses this is interesting, I think. He says, limiting how much to accept of the Dharma, of the Dharmas, the things, right, one has already received, is knowing one has enough. I'll read that again. Limiting how much to accept of the dharmas one already has received is knowing one has enough. And he goes on, despite having great wealth, a person not knowing when to be satisfied is in fact impoverished. And I think that we can see this in our culture pretty clearly, right? We never have enough. The more we have, the more we want. And for some people, this is a source of great suffering and the infliction of great suffering on others because it's never enough. And, you know, in something very simple like our meal practice, we can enact this. Like, we just accept what's offered. Maybe oatmeal isn't your favorite thing. We take just what we need, right? That's the practice of oryoki. It means just enough. And we consume everything we take. So that's a very fundamental opportunity to experience this. What do I really need? What is enough? I'm being offered a whole pot. Do I need seconds, right? It's a very simple, embodied way of practicing with this particular instruction. Number 3, appreciating serenity or quietude is called by Dogen enjoying peace of mind. And I think this is less an internal state, although we do internalize quietude. But Dogen says, avoiding noisy, bustling places that confuse the mind and living alone in a quiet, serene dwelling is what he recommends. I don't know about you. I live with my husband and 2 cats, and it's not always quiet and serene. But we can carry the serenity and quietude with us. And I think when we are in the Zendo, we can try to carry, that's part of carrying our practice off the cushion to maintain that appreciation for quiet, being with others and quiet, that internal orientation to quiet. Quieting our minds, quieting our desires can help us outside of the Zendo. It's a kind of hermit practice, always alone, even with others. And, you know, in Buddha's time, that's how monks would practice. They were alone most of the time. They would come together during the rainy season to practice together and hear the teachings. But a lot of the times they were solitary wanderers. The Buddha actually says, if you take pleasure in being in a group, you will surely encounter the disharmony or suffering of the group, right? This would denigrate the 3 treasures, the third of the 3 treasures, which is Sangha, right? The disharmony of the group is really a grave issue in Buddhism. To cause disharmony in the Sangha is considered a grave offense, right? I don't know how many of you know the name of the teacher Sawaki Kodo, also known as Homeless Kodo, a teacher of the 19th, early 20th century, and the teacher of Uchiyama Roshi, who was the teacher of Shohaku Okamura in Indiana. And Sawaki Kodo, Homeless Kodo, who didn't have a temple of his own and wandered up and down Japan offering the teachings to everybody, he called the kind of living in a confusing community, he called it Grupu Boko. Grupu Boke, sorry. Grupu is just the Japanese pronunciation of group. And Boke is a kind of dementia, a kind of. And this is not Sangha, right? This is not what Sangha is. It is not group dementia. It is the intentional community, the precious community, one of the 3 jewels. So when Buddha is suggesting we withdraw from worldly affairs, he means regular society and cultivating our calm mind. And we do this in company of like-minded people who are all making the same effort. And yeah, sometimes there's disharmony, but we meet it with our generous and compassionate hearts. Okay, so we're halfway through the list almost. 4th, making diligent effort or persevering. The Japanese word in this case is shojin, which is energetic action without giving up, like continuous energetic action in everything we do. And the Buddha, again, as quoted by Dogen, so Dogen is really calling upon the Buddha in writing this essay of his own. The Buddha compared this kind of effort to making a fire by twirling a stick in your hands, like, you know, how you Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts do that, until friction ignites the tinder, right? So we make this effort and something catches. If you stop twirling the stick, you won't have fire. And it also reminds me of a koan, a teaching story that Dogen quotes to close out one of his most important essays, which is the Genjo Koan, or Actualizing the Fundamental Point. It's one translation of that title. And Dogen in that essay says, he closes with the story. He says, Zen master Bao Che of Mount Mayu, this is China, Tang Dynasty China, he was fanning himself. A monk approached and said, Master, the nature of wind is permanent, and there is no place it does not reach. Why then do you fan yourself? I thought he was going to pin the master down. And the master replied, although you understand the nature of wind is permanent, you do not understand the meaning of its reaching everywhere. So the monk said, okay, what's the meaning of its reaching everywhere? And the master just kept making this effort. Didn't say anything, just, and the monk couldn't do anything but bow, right? So the actualization of the Buddha Dharma, says Dogen in this fascicle, the vital path of its correct transmission is like this. You can't have wind without fanning. You can't have the wind of the Buddha's house without making effort. We need effort. There's nothing we lack. We can have fire, we can have wind, but it needs our activity. It needs our engagement, or it doesn't appear. Fifth, not forgetting the teaching, right? Or sometimes it's said, observing the true teaching. Right? To do this is not to fall prey to the thieves of greed, ignorance, and anger, which are also known as the three poisons, or the three poisonous minds: greed, hate, and delusion, we sometimes say. So this is the Buddha speaking. He says, it's like wearing armor and being in a strong fortress. You have no fear if you have the teaching. If you don't forget the teaching, you won't fall victim to the three poisons. And there's a teacher in the lineage of Sawaki Kodo, Sawaki, whom I just quoted, whose name is Daitsu Tom Wright. And he suggests that the true teaching that's being referred to here is how Buddha nature, our life force, truly functions. With the life force that's empty of independent self and completely interdependent, right? This is the true teaching, to remember interdependence, or remember impermanence is another way we could say it. Okay, 3 more. The 6th is practicing jhana. And the word is often translated as meditation. And the Japanese word Zen is actually the same word, right, as Sanskrit's jhana. So jhana and Zen are the same thing, the same root. And jhana can also be translated as samadhi, or concentration. In this essay, the Japanese characters that Dogen uses are kind of interesting. They are Shuzenjo. Dogen says in his instructions for Zazen, the Fukan Zazengi, he says, Shuzen is actually not really Zazen. Shuzen is learning meditation. That's how we usually translate it. Zazen is not learning meditation, he says. And what he's saying is, it's not a technique. Shuzen is a technique, like maybe counting your breaths. It's not the same thing as just sitting, or shikantaza, we sometimes say. Right? It's not manipulated. It's not contrived. It's not fabricated. So it might seem that the Buddha is recommending this kind of not zazen when the Japanese says shu zen jo. But again, Tom Wright says that this jo is kind of an interpretive translation of the term, that what we call zazen is an interpretive translation of the Sanskrit term jhana. And this is why Dogen says to settle undisturbed in the Dharma is called practicing jhana, right? To simply, I think Katagiri says this, to settle the self on the self, the small self on the big self, or the small self in the big self. And the Buddha said that this jhana is the way to contemplate the working of the mind and become familiar with the comings and goings of all things. And this requires awareness, marshaling awareness in sitting quietly and letting go of everything else. Number 7 is practicing wisdom, which is here in Japanese called shuchi-e, prajna in Sanskrit. And this is embodying the wisdom of liberation from attachments and gain from hearing the teachings, contemplating them, and practicing them, right? Putting into motion these other qualities that we've already talked about, especially effort. And it's related to not being greedy. Wisdom is not being greedy. And the Buddha says this, that by being freed from cravings, is already discussed in several other places, that this is wisdom. The Buddha is pretty strong here. This is what he says. He says, one who does not act like this cannot be said to be a person of the way, right? So if you're a person filled with craving, if you're completely consumed by attachment, you are not a person of the way. He says, wisdom is like a boat that will carry you and others across the sea of sickness, old age, and death. And it is like a lamp lighting up ignorance and darkness, and other language like this, right? So he's very clear about the importance of wisdom, and wisdom as liberation from attachment and craving. Finally, we come to the 8th virtue, not engaging in useless argument or idle talk. Dogen says about this, to realize the Buddha's teaching and not engage in illusory discrimination, not engaging in useless argument. And he continues, to pursue the true reality of dharmas is nothing other than not getting involved in useless discussion. That seems a very strong admonition. The way the Buddha put it is, if you wish to enjoy the peace and serenity of nirvana, all you need to do is wipe out the sickness of idle talk or useless discussion. And I think this is related to giving up worldly affairs, but it's also a support for equanimity and stillness. So when I finish, maybe you can tell me what you think about that one. But these are the 8 awakenings. These are the 8 awakenings of a truly great being or person, a mature person, that Dogen lists. And at the end of his essay, he kind of emphasizes how important and how essential these qualities are. He says, in my time, so this is more than 800 years ago now, he says, only 1 or 2 out of 1,000 monks know of these virtues. So even though he considers them essential, it's like very few monks even actually know of them. And he reminds us that to encounter the Dharma at any time is rare. For a human being to encounter the Dharma is a rare thing. To have a human birth itself is rare. And he says that our good fortune in hearing and practicing this teaching is due to good karmic roots from beginningless existence. Dogen concludes, therefore, it is critical for us to study and practice, to expand this merit in each successive life, to realize deepest wisdom, and finally, just as the Buddha did, to expound that teaching for all sentient beings. So don't waste this chance, is what he's saying to us. And at the very end of his essay, he has an interesting comment. He says, each of these 8 qualities contain all the others. So it's really 64 qualities, right? 8 times 8. That's the math he does to come up with 64 qualities, not just 8, 64. But he says, from a broader perspective, the virtues or qualities are unlimited, right? They're unlimited. Nevertheless, as I said, Buddhism loves lists. And, if you Google Buddhist lists, I did this once, you'll find a lot of versions of lists of Buddhist qualities or things to remember, and some of which are structured like maps of the Buddhist teaching. So I just want to talk about this for a moment, because I'm sure some of you or all of you have heard at least of some of these lists, right? So like the 4 Noble Truths. We always say 4 Noble Truths. We don't just say noble truths. We say 4 Noble Truths. The Eightfold Path. There are 5 aggregates or skandhas, and we always say 5 skandhas. There are 10 perfections. There are also a list of 6 perfections and a whole lot more. And if we look into some of these lists, we find that they contain some of these 8 virtues that Dogen chooses for us. It's a curated list, right? For example, we could look at the very ancient 4 Brahmaviharas, or sometimes they're called the 4 heavenly abodes, or the 4 immeasurables. They're all the same thing. And these actually go back to before Buddhism. They're Vedic. They're what we now call Hindu teachings. And the 4 immeasurables are metta. You've probably heard of metta, right? Which is most often translated as loving kindness. The second is karuna, which is usually translated as compassion and derives from metta. There's mudita, which is sympathetic or empathetic joy, joy in the good fortune of others, in the happiness of others, and upekkha. Upekkha is equanimity, right? And these build on one another, starting with metta, loving kindness, and leading ultimately to equanimity, serenity, impartiality, right? So you might hear echoes of these 4 in Dogen's 8. Another that people often practice with are the 6 paramitas, the 6 perfections. Dana, or giving, shila, or ethical behavior, the precepts, kshanti, which is patience or forbearance, virya, vigorous effort, there's that one, jhana, again, meditation, and prajna, wisdom. So this list is one that Mahayana Buddhism as a whole embraces. And in this one, though, notice metta doesn't even appear, right? In the 6 perfections, it's just not there. And compassion doesn't appear, which seems so fundamental. But there's giving or generosity, which is really closely related to having few desires and knowing what is enough. We also see vigorous effort. So the Pali Suttas, the Buddha's teachings, his original teachings as written down in the Pali language, there's like a source for more of these lists. There, as I mentioned, 10 perfections too. And there's an earlier list of perfections than the sixth. So various versions of this. Dogen is following in a tradition of lists and making his own. So we can note there are different emphases in these lists, but there's also overlap, right? And we can notice that Dogen says that the 8 virtues, the final teaching of Shakyamuni Buddha, are the teaching of the Mahayana, the greater school of Buddhism into which we fit, the great vehicle that carries everyone to nirvana, not just us individually. And so he is staking a claim centuries after the Buddha and thousands of miles away from India to the heart of the Buddhist teaching in this final teaching of his. So I want to close with one more list. The Bodhisattva's 4 methods of guidance. This is an essay of Dogen. It's different than the 4 Brahma Viharas. And he wrote it in 1243, which was 10 years before his death. So right in the middle of his teaching career. And the 4 methods are these: generosity, kind speech, beneficial action, and a 4th, which is sometimes translated as identity action, or sometimes translated as simultaneity. That's the hardest one to actually get your hands around. All of these are actually expressions of non-separation, of non-duality. The 4 methods of guidance are Dogen's expression of the 4 immeasurables that I talked about a minute ago. Dogen says about giving, for example, that giving is for the sake of giving, not for the expectation of good karma or merit or praise or anything else. It's not giving to get something. It expresses instead the fundamental identity of self and other. And he says that kind speech, the second one, is how Buddha handles sentient beings. Babies. Kind speech is handling each other like babies, delicate babies. And at the time of angry speech, this is helpful right now, I think, especially because there's a lot of angry speech in the world. It's helpful to remember Dogen's words. He says, as long as your present life lasts, you should take pleasure in speaking compassionately. Generation after generation, let us exert ourselves unremittingly. So there's effort, right? Compassionate speech is fundamental to the pacification of enemies and the reconciliation of rulers. That one is on my refrigerator. Dogen speaks of compassion as the seed of loving kindness, rather than the other way around. Compassion is the seed of loving kindness, not loving kindness is the seed of compassion. He says, consider this: kind speech has the power to influence even the imperial mind, even the mind of the emperor. He says, it is not just to speak highly of others' strengths and achievements. It's not flattery. Truly kind speech might sound angry, but if its root is compassion, then it's kind. The third guidance of the 4 methods of guidance of the Bodhisattva, which is all of us, the third guidance is beneficial action, to work for the welfare of all beings without expecting any repayment or even any result, just to make the effort. Dogen says to assist self and others without discrimination. He says, if you grasp this truth, if you get it, you will see that this is the reason that even grasses and trees, wind and water are all naturally engaged in the activity of benefiting others. They don't have to think about it. They just function. That's their function, to benefit others. He says that the practice of benefiting others is, in Japanese, ippo, which means a complete truth, a whole truth, nothing but the truth. And this is a lot like the first guidance of giving or generosity without any expectation, just for the sake of giving. And then there's this last one, doji, or identity action, or simultaneity. And I think after grappling with this for a while, I think that this is how Dogen understands the workings and expression of loving kindness and compassion. Dogen says that doji, identity action, means non-difference, non-difference from self, non-difference from others, not discriminating between self and other, which is really the non-duality that Buddhism expresses. He says, action, the action part of identity action, action means right form, dignity, correct manner. This means that you cause yourself to be in identity with others after causing others to be in identity with you. However, the relationship of self and others varies limitlessly according to circumstance. And I think in these words, we can recall the Buddha's exhortation to being free from attachments. But I think it goes deeper than that. How do we do this? How do we cause ourselves to be in identity with others after causing others to be in identity with us in the midst of useless speech and conflict, right? I think keeping this in mind at all times is a huge practice. So I'll conclude here. Although Dogen embraced the Bodhisattva way and he offered his own methods of guidance and training in the eight awakenings of great beings and the 4 methods of guidance of a Bodhisattva, he closed his teachings, which wasn't deliberate necessarily, but he knew he was dying. I mean, he knew he was not thriving. It took him a while to die. But towards the end, in 1253, he closed with the Buddha's teaching of the 8 qualities, the Buddha's final teaching. And in doing this, I think he was reenacting, recapitulating the final sermon of Buddha in his own life and death. These fundamental qualities support us to wake up, right? This is all our teachers want, is for us to wake up, and can be practiced by anyone. You don't have to be a monk. You can just be you. And they recall the most ancient ethical teachings of pre-Buddhist India. So they're deeply rooted in the Buddhist time and place, but they transcend that time and place. And as anyone can follow them, let's see if we can, and if we can benefit self and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you have time, we'll take comments or questions. Suggestions.
No comments.
I can start.
Start, Tara.
Hi, Choro. I'm off the screen, but this is Mjoren.
Mjoren.
See you. Thank you for being here today.
You.
I'm wondering if you could say a bit more. Sometimes when I come across lists in Buddhism, I kind of tune out. It's just lists of things. And so I wonder if you could say a bit more just about how to work with these lists, like the one you presented today, how to integrate them, kind of enliven them in our own practice.
Yeah, one reason I gave this talk is I was really struck by this final teaching of Dogen. Like, well, what were his last words? You know, what was his last advice to us? But also because it really did seem to echo this ancient practice of making lists. And it can be confusing. I understand that tuning out, you know, it just feels like rote memorization that I grew up with. That's how we learned in my day, you know, memorize this, including like multiplication tables. Anybody remember multiplication tables? Comma, right? So I have a resistance to that too, but I also realized that there could be, you know, some real wisdom in these. And so I began to look for patterns, basically. And it seems that the emphasis, you know, Dogen chose these 8, like I said, sort of a curated list, but you can find them, you know, in different other lists made at other times by the Buddha or by other teachers in our long 2,500 years of Buddhist practice. So I decided to start from Dogen because Dogen's our guy, and try to follow it out, like to see where there are these points of contact and what they have in common, and then what speaks to me. It's kind of like working with the precepts. You know, you can pick any one and work with it, and after a while you realize, just like Dogen said about his 8, each of them contains all the others. If you really keep any one of the precepts completely, you pretty much could keep them all. You know, they kind of are all totally interrelated. They're not exactly the same. You know, some are more about speech, others are, you know, more about other kinds of activity or states of mind, but they, keep one, keep them all. And if you look deeply in any of them, like what is not to kill, right? Just to think about the 16 precepts, what is not to kill? You take it literally, but you can also really, it expands and expands the more that you work with it. So I try to find what in any given list that some teacher I respect, drew up as good advice. And, right now, the not engaging in useless argument is the one that's up for me, if I had to pick one. Yeah. So, yeah, if the list turns you off, just find one thing that maybe catches your attention and try it on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Pam. How are you? Pam showed you, whatever my name is. And you're right, this is an amazingly straightforward list. And kind of tying back to Tara's point, I've spent more time over the last couple of years, probably because of my work with prisoners, going more deeply into some of these lists, like the paramitas, etc. And I do find, just like this list of Dogen, that for me, it narrows things down, because you do see that it all comes kind of down to the same ball of wax in a way, that they're all related to, I don't know, whatever is this inexpressible central idea of Buddhism. But I was also interested in the fact that Dogen's 8 qualities don't incorporate, at least to me on first reference, don't incorporate those 4 guidance, the metta, the compassion, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In some ways, like the question that sometimes I get, we have one member here who is really devoted to the early teachings because they help him. They're, like the 4 Noble Truths, the 12-fold, chain of causation. It's like breaks things down into pieces that he can understand. And it's, it's the Buddha's teaching, so he can't find fault with it. But I like the term how the Mahayana unfolds the teaching, we say sometimes, at least in Suzuki Roshi's lineage, we say that, unfolding the Dharma. And so I feel like the Dharma is infinitely, I don't want to say expandable as if, we stretch it or something, or dissolve it, because that has the sense of like diluting it. But as Buddhism traveled, from culture to culture and language to language, and encountered, different people who adapted it, and in some ways Buddhism doesn't have a form, but you can pour it into different cultures. And we're doing that now. We're trying to understand what's the essence of the teaching now in the West, here in America, in our culture, in our time. So I'm meandering a little bit here, but I think what I want to say is the original teachings are very direct, and I've worked with prisoners too, and when they hear the 4 Noble Truths, they kind of like immediately, there's something that speaks to them usually. Oh yeah, that's what happened. And karma, they're often very interested in karma. Karma. As some kind of explanation for how they found themselves where they are. But you can unpack all of this infinitely. It's like Dogen says, the lists are infinite, the qualities are infinite, right? And the more you look at any one of them, the more they kind of open up. I guess I want to say open up, like Dharma is like a bud, and it just keeps it, opening and opening and opening, flowering. So it's something like that is how I feel about, this. So maybe we don't need to talk about metta, or karuna, because we can take them for granted. There's that list, and this list is unpacking this in a different kind of way. It's asking us to think, what is selflessness? How do we actualize the teaching of no self, of no separation between ourselves and anyone else or anything else? How do we do that? And that's what the mission of Dogen is, I think, in this set. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, just one more. I mean, I think that in this set, the one that was most interesting to me was about wisdom, which I usually struggle to, try to explain, because it's no self, it's all these things that are so hard to express. And the fact that he just says, don't be greedy is just, that's, there's a lot to unfold right there. That's very interesting.
Yeah. The wisdom of liberation from attachments is what he says. The wisdom of liberation from attachments is wisdom. And, we often pair wisdom and compassion. They're like, I've often heard it's like two wings of a bird. You don't have wisdom without compassion, and you don't have compassion without wisdom. And that helps us to not mistake wisdom for something else, like know-how, like just knowing the teachings is not wisdom. And feeling empathy is not compassion. It's not an emotion. Right. So it's really hard to talk about all of these things. So cutting through, instead of trying to define what it is, saying it's freedom from greed is like, oh, yeah, because if you are free from greed and you practice from that place of not being greedy, of not sticking to things, of not being attached, of not wanting more, right? You can't find fault with that as a basis from which to live your life and be with other people. You won't manipulate them. You won't try to build up yourself. You won't try to get things. Right? So the more you kind of work with each one of these, you can see how it implies that aren't explicitly spoken of.
Oh, yeah, hi, it's Vicki. Thank you for your talk. I have a question. There's a lot of talk in there about removing yourself from this environment, removing yourself from noisy environments, removing yourself, becoming, kind of more solitary, not listening to the news and being involved in worldly things. But at the same time, shutting things out is also against kind of our practice. So I see a real interesting interplay there. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, this comes up a lot. I think, and for good reason, we're in the world.
Right.
And we don't try to withdraw from the world, although it looks like we are sometimes. Like here you are sitting on a Sunday morning in this nice space that you have with your Dharma friends listening to this talk, and you're not doing something else. But I think, again, it's like we cultivate these things. We withdraw so that we can re-engage, as bodhisattvas. And so we take that inner calm. I don't know about you, but when I read a lot of news and I start talking about it with my husband or friends, I feel that agitation. I feel, anxiety.
Very
I
much.
feel, like what is going to happen, not just far away, right? But right here in our country, in our communities, what is happening. And that anxiety doesn't actually help. It doesn't actually help, but maintaining some equanimity and some serenity that can encourage other people not to engage in conflict. It doesn't mean we put up with everything. We don't speak out when it's important to speak out. But someone yesterday, after I gave a talk yesterday at the temple, and we were talking about what is skillful speech? When is it time to speak? And when is it time not to speak? And he talked about a protest he went to years ago in Oakland. I think it was a climate action, and people were like, they had signs, they had chants, and they were sure they were, the righteousness of their cause. And I'm not arguing. But what the Buddhists were doing, I don't know if it was the Berkeley Zen Center that organized this, but some group of Bay Area Buddhists showed up with their zafus and zabatons and set up on a hill overlooking this big, noisy, angry, upset group of people. And they started sitting Zazen.
Mhm.
And people were running by with their signs and they stopped, like did a double take.
Mhm.
And some of them started joining them. They put the signs down and they sat down. And by the time the protest was over, there were 150 people sitting on the hill. And so I can't tell you why all those people stopped. And maybe they went on and joined the protest. They sat for a little while, but that was the high point of the group that was sitting. And sometimes, we think we need to make a lot of noise, but what we just want is to bear witness. We want to be with people who will bear witness with us and approach this not from the point of view of yelling and screaming and suffering, because we make all this effort to show up and nothing changes. Easy to get discouraged, but it's easier, I think, to be encouraged when there are all these people with you silently sharing presence, bearing witness, being kind to the situation. And it makes an impression. Nonviolence has a big impact. So I think that's the direction. It may come from a monastic tradition of solitariness, but I think that the direction is, can you be a refuge for yourself and others?
Okay, thank you. I know Nonan has told that story before. That's a great story. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Yeah, without cutting off anything.
Right.
But can you be a refuge?
Anyone else? Well, thank you once again. Wonderful Dharma talk. Very much appreciate you visiting us again.
The invitation. I look forward to someday meeting you all in person. It'd be nice to visit.
We do too.
All right. It's finally cold and raining in Austin, so there's that.
Beautiful
Never gets
day
cold
here.
in Austin.
Well, enjoy it.
Okay.
All right. Till the next time. Please continue your practice.
Thank you.
We will.
Thank you.
Call and response.